Well, good morning, Lighthouse. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And again, before you listen to me talk about the Bible, or before you listen to anybody talk about the Bible, I hope you've taken just a few minutes and read the Bible itself. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Make some notes, do a little study. Remember way back when we talked about, man, make some observations. Just go through, don't ask what it means. Don't ask what it means to you. Just observe it. Read what it says. And read what it says carefully without importing a bunch of ideas that you've heard or things that you've been taught or things that you already bring into it. Read the text for what it is. And then take a minute and say, okay, if that's what it says, then what would that mean? And take those observations and try to come up with, I always have my students come up with a principle. So something that is always true, that doesn't, it applies to you, but it applies to everybody for all time. Something that you could say, okay, what's God trying to teach me? And this has to be soaked in prayer. I hope you are prayerfully reading the scriptures. And then lastly, that you just have taken a minute to meditate and say, okay, God, how do I apply this? How do I be more like you? How does this help me reflect you to the world? And how does this grow our relationship? How do I love you more, love you better, know I'm loved by you more? So I hope you've done that. And then as we dive into this particular, if you have questions, Friday's coming, questions at lighthousebaptist.net. Would love for you to, you and me to interact over any questions you have about life or the Bible or theology or philosophy or whatever. But as we dig into the 10th chapter of 2 Corinthians, maybe now that you've read it, you would say, before you get going and we start teaching it here, in fact, we might not get any further than the 6th verse in this. What does Paul mean when he says that he does not use the weapons of this world to destroy arguments? What would the weapons of this world be? I wonder if you would just even jot down or just make a mental list right now and say, if somebody was going to tell me, hey, these are the weapons to destroy arguments, and they had a very philosophically minded culture, they thought a lot about the thinkers at the university. And we see that as Paul goes to Athens, and is sparring with the philosophers of the day, but maybe there were ways that these arguments got crafted and arguments got defended. And Paul at some point says, look, we just don't use the same weapons of the world. And it might be easy to think about like violence and military weapons, and maybe that's a piece of it. But what do you think Paul's talking about as he talks about defending arguments? Well, what kinds of things in the public square get used to defend arguments or to destroy arguments? Is it not things like anger, like raising your voice, like personal insults, like bitterness, like any kind of logical fallacies, like personal insults and sarcasm and being dismissive of somebody else, which is weird because Jesus said, man, don't say you empty-headed one. Don't say raka, you call somebody else a fool. And yet that really seems to be the order of the day, doesn't it? That when we come up with arguments we disagree with, or when we're in discourse with the world, it very quickly dissolves to personal insult, to calling somebody an idiot. And so maybe before we read, you would just think, what are the weapons of argumentation of this world? Not like the things you learned in school, rhetoric. That's rhetoric and logic. That's not what you see in the public square very often. It's certainly not what you see on social media. So what are the things that people use? Isn't it things like being dismissive, like personal insult, like raising your voice, like anger? Okay, so Paul's going to jump in, and the thing you're going to see in this passage more and more as he develops it is Paul's continuing to defend, hey, we're not walking like the flesh. We are solid believers and passed on a good gospel to you. And so look in verse 3. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. So what a great dichotomy Paul brings up that we all have to struggle with. Look, there'll be a day when we have new bodies. There'll be a day when these bodies are no longer ours. But for now, we walk in the flesh. And Paul doesn't just mean flesh, but when he talks about flesh, he talks about the system of the world. So Paul acknowledges, look, we're not monks. We haven't headed for the hills and removed ourselves from society or culture. No, rather, we're walking in and among the culture of the day, but we are not waging war according to the flesh. So he says, look, we go to all the places that everybody else goes to have discussions. We go to all the places where people are making up their mind about the gospel, about Christ. We engage in culturally appropriate ways, and yet our arguments, our discussions, the way we wage this war is not the way everybody else is doing it. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. So the power is not coming from Paul. Look, he says, for our weapons of warfare are not of the flesh. They're not the worldly system. They're not I raise my voice and I get angry and I call somebody an idiot and I try to just puff myself up. No, that's how other people argue. But Paul says, no, we don't argue with the weapons of this world. We present a different kind of argument. And one of the things Paul's doing here is he's trying to make account for why he's so meek in person and so speaks so strong when he writes. And apparently, in person, Paul was a very meek, kind of understated guy, and he's trying to describe, you know why I didn't stand up and yell at everybody? Well, because our arguments come in different ways, and it has a lot more to do with how we live, how we act, than it does with being the loudest mouth in the room. So we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Man, what a beautiful practice that is, to take every thought captive, a thought that comes from my head or a thought that comes from someplace else, but say, no, I'm going to take this captive so that I continue to obey Christ. I'm going to make the how I make decisions on how I live and how I think is going to have nothing to do with who's the loudest voice in the room or whatever argument I see in the world. Rather, I'm going to take every thought captive. I'm going to take this idea, I'm going to bring it before God, and I'm going to say, hey, God, does this please you? This behavior, this decision, this way of living, does this please you? Do I make you happier? Is this being more like you? Dad, am I being an obedient son as I jump into this thought behavior? So I take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. And Paul says, look, this is in some way about lofty arguments, but man, you know what this is about? Is simple obedience. Paul is not hoping to engage in some, proof that he's right about the world. And as he defends himself to these people, as he is continuing to convince him that he's the real deal, that God really sent him, that they are his letter, that he had a valid ministry and still does in their lives, he's saying, look, I'm not trying to be the loudest voice in the room or to win all the arguments. I write forcefully because I'm far away and you can't see how I live. But when I'm with you, man, I try to live a humble life where you can just see what a simple Christian life looks like. That is a profound style of leadership. And if you are leading a family, or you're leading a business, or you're leading a friend group in your neighborhood, if you have influence in anybody's life, wouldn't it be great advice to make this what we take out of this passage? First of all, our words have to back up our lifestyle. If we are bitter, resentful, hateful, bigoted, unforgiving, cruel, obnoxious, and then say, well, I follow Jesus, man, we're a heretic, because you're not following Jesus. You're not acting like Jesus at all. So Paul says, look, I'm going to have the simplicity of my life be the thing I lead with. When I'm with you, I want you to see humility. I want you to see kindness. I want you to see just a low profile guy. When I'm away, I write more forcefully because those words are going to back up. When I insist that you live humbly, I hope you're going to remember that, that's how Paul lived. When I say, hey, you have to forgive the sinner, I hope you're going to think back and go, that's how Paul was. He was a forgiving guy. So what are we've been given this responsibility to take the message of Christ to our whole world. What are the weapons we use? How do we defend what we believe? And how do we present this argument to the world? Well, I think Paul would have us do it in such a way where we lead with simple, humble behavior, and then the words we say make sense. Hey, be loved, Lighthouse.